thousands of secret crimes take place.
Child sexual abuse is a private matter, a very private matter. So there are realistically no eyewitnesses to it.
But for many, child sexual abuse is literally unspeakable, a terrible crime, terribly easy to deny.
People can't take it emotionally. It's easier not to recognise abuse than to recognise abuse.
The past 10 years have seen judicial inquiries and wholesale changes in the law, yet children are no better protected.
We still don't know how best to protect children. We don't know how best to get them through the legal system so that their voices are heard.
Why is society still unwilling to confront child sexual abuse? Why, after a decade of upheaval from Cleveland to Orkney, are families better protected than the children who grow up within them?
I moved to Cleveland when I was nearly 7 and lived there until I was 16. I was the eldest of several children, and my father was a manager of a local business. As a child, I was in ballet classes and went to Girl Guides. As a family, most of us went to church. Throughout my childhood, my father was sexually abusing me and physically abusing me and emotionally abusing me. I suffered it for 17 years because the grown-ups around me wouldn't make it stop.
What happened in Cleveland should not have happened and must not be allowed to happen again.
This is an indictment of certain individuals within the health service and an indictment of certain individuals within the social services.
If the truth were known, then I think Cleveland would be an even greater scandal than people already imagine it to be.
For 10 years, Cleveland has been shrouded in myths. Myths about 2 doctors and the techniques they used. Myths about the children they examined. And myths about happy families broken up by predatory social workers.
I think the biggest myth, which is still unfortunately persisting, is that children for some reason would turn up at Middlesbrough General Hospital with a sore finger or an earache, and before they knew where they were having their bottoms examined and being declared sexually abused.
The reality is very different.
The stereotype, I would say, was wholly inaccurate. That in fact there was very considerable concern about many of the children involved prior to them being seen by doctors.
The second myth was that doctors relied on one discredited sign, reflex anal dilatation, RAD, to diagnose all the children.
But that was the myth that was taken ahead, and most people think Cleveland RAD, rubbish sign.
That was inaccurate. The sign has not been discredited. It is a sign that is in forensic textbooks, and we do now increasingly understand why it happens.
And the most persistent myth of all, the myth that all the parents were innocent and wrongly torn from their children.
Some of the children had been abused, yes, and anyone applying reason to those situations would come to that conclusion.
But behind the myths, one bitter truth: adults' voices are always louder than children's.
Nobody thought about poor children who were involved. Nobody thought, we listen to the children and see what their story is. It was all the parents and the children weren't listened to.
At the heart of the crisis were two paediatricians, Marietta Higgs and Geoffrey Wyatt, and their medical diagnoses of abuse on 121 children. 10 years on, neither doctor is free to take part in this film.
Cleveland was about pioneering work. We were working at the frontiers of knowledge and the development of knowledge about child sexual abuse.
Sue Richardson was appointed child abuse consultant for Cleveland County Council in 1986.
Child sexual abuse had only recently become a registration category on the child abuse register, and there were no guidelines as such as to how it should be dealt with.
Sue Richardson has never spoken out before and risks her career in doing so now.
Cleveland was the first major event, as it were, that brought the whole issue onto the public agenda. It was also the start of the backlash in this country against professionals for their actions.
Although there had been prosecutions for sexual abuse, Cleveland Police and Social Services traditionally relied on children to make an initial complaint. The result was a tide of undiscovered abuse cases waiting to break. Ruth was one of Cleveland's undetected victims of sexual abuse. Although she was not one of the 121 children caught up in the crisis, she knows what many of them were going through.
I was threatened by my father that if I told, I would be called a liar. Any child abuser will put the responsibility on the child that the abuse is their fault and that the responsibility for keeping it secret is their responsibility. As adults, we don't give a child the responsibility to diagnose a broken limb if they've fallen. And it seems unfair to wait for a child to tell you that they've been abused if they don't have the words, or if they can't, or if they daren't, or if they're frightened.
To break this vicious circle of silence, social workers referred children to the paediatricians at Middlesbrough General Hospital. Marietta Higgs' training on how to recognise medical evidence of abuse on young children's bodies was viewed as a breakthrough.
Here for the first time was the possibility of closing a loophole which abusers had relied on for many years, that little children would be unable to tell and that they would be able to abuse children without anyone finding out. So it was an enormous breakthrough for children.
One of the techniques used by Dr. Higgs was called reflex anal dilatation, a simple test to see whether a child's anus showed signs of recent penetration.
And the anus is normally tightly closed with radiating skin folds. And in a young child, after sort of 10-12 seconds, the external sphincter relaxes, but you can't sink up into the rectum because the internal sphincter is closed. But in fact, if the child has been anally abused, the internal sphincter may relax too, and the whole rectum dilate up, and you can see it right up into the rectum, and that's a sign, reflex anal dilatation.
This was a new presentation for me, really, because many of the children were very young, and they hadn't made an alerting comment, or if they had, it hadn't been brought to anyone's attention. So, in effect, they hadn't made any disclosures.
The first children to be diagnosed by Dr. Higgs were two little girls aged 4 and 2. Their family, later given the code letter M, had worried social workers for nearly 3 years. The elder child had been admitted to hospital 7 times for failure to thrive.
It culminated, I think, at a time when the health visitor was shown a lot of bruising. Like 60-something little bruises on a child.
When she examined the older girl, Dr. Higgs found evidence that the child had also been sexually abused. both children were taken into care and placed with a foster family in Middlesbrough. For 4 years, social services and police had been at loggerheads over the investigation of suspected sexual abuse.
There was a backlog of conflict surrounding the police and the police surgeon, specifically about the police and social work cooperation in joint investigations and the role of the police surgeon. I think there was a reluctance to give up turf, to hand over one's territory. The police were very concerned that they wanted to remain in charge of any investigations, and the police surgeons likewise wanted to be in charge of the medical investigation.
Dr. Alistair Irvine, a local GP, was senior police surgeon for Cleveland. In March 1987, he secretly warned the police not to trust Dr. Higgs and the increasing number of sexual abuse diagnoses she was making. Within weeks, those numbers would rise dramatically. In May, the 2 children from the M family were re-examined prior to a court hearing. Dr. Higgs found new signs of anal abuse in both children. If the abuse had happened whilst the children were in their foster home, all the children in that house were potentially at risk.
As a result of that, further inquiries were made into circumstances in the foster home, and the foster parents' children were also seen and examined, and it appeared that they too had been subject of sexual abuse.
A paediatrician from outside Cleveland examined the children and confirmed the diagnoses.
Some of the children had abnormal genital signs, some of them had abnormal anal signs, some of them had both abnormal genital and anal signs. And so I was able to do a clinical examination. We photographed the children, so we had documentation there. And then I wrote up my opinions, what the physical signs were, what they might be consistent with.
But a crisis was brewing. From seeing only a handful of cases, Middlesbrough General Hospital was now struggling to cope with several referrals a day. On May the 21st, a family of 3 children, code-lettered AA/E, was referred to Marietta Higgs after the eldest girl made a partial disclosure.
She was describing sexual intercourse going on in her bed, adults having intercourse in her bed, and she described stains on the sheets and things, which a small child wouldn't have understood about at that stage. But that was the kind of concern that we had, that things were happening in that house which the children shouldn't have had sight of, really, shouldn't have known about.
With her mother's consent, Dr. Higgs examined the girl. She found evidence of gross damage to her vagina and anus, but before she could examine the 2 younger children, their father, already on police bail for unrelated offences, stormed onto the ward.
Father's response to Dr. Higgs finding signs, as she felt, of sexual abuse, that he just removed the children and hid them, and then got the police and the police surgeon to come and examine the children again.
Social workers immediately obtained a place of safety order, but the police refused to implement it. Instead, police surgeons carried out a secret examination of the children. They saw no evidence of abuse.
There was such a dispute over the medical diagnosis that really it was difficult for the police to accept that the children needed to be investigated for child sexual abuse, and as a result, that particular family of children suffered greatly because of the conflict between the doctors. The way in which they suffered is that they ended up being medically examined and re-examined 4 or 5 times.
The opposition to Dr. Higgs' diagnoses was led by senior police surgeon Alistair Irvine. On May the 28th, Sue Richardson called a meeting to try and resolve the conflict.
It was myself and 2 or 3 very senior police officers present, and the meeting degenerated into the most appalling situation I've ever been in my professional career, where Dr. Irving was calling Dr. Higgs incompetent and misguided, demanding that I choose between them, and generally getting out of control and in a very emotionally heated state.
Immediately after the meeting, Cleveland Police issued a secret memo telling its officers to treat with caution any diagnosis of sexual abuse made by Dr. Higgs. Social Services issued their own confidential memo instructing staff to bypass the police surgeons and seek a place of safety order whenever a diagnosis was made.
I suppose, really, it was the wrong use of a place of safety order because it was fundamentally to protect the children from the police and police surgeons and repeated medical examinations.
From then on, the police increasingly withdrew from any investigations.
Eventually, they simply took their bat home. There's no other way of putting it. And they became increasingly reluctant to investigate cases at all. Things were said to parents that the paediatrician's diagnoses were not to be relied on. Parents reported that to me, that they didn't know what to think, they didn't know what to believe because a paediatrician had told them one thing and then a police officer had come along and told them not to take that seriously. And it was causing absolute chaos, really.
Particularly with the police being warned off and told not to believe what was happening. That caused splinters and splintering of all the good work that had been done. And unfortunately, the children were the ones that were left in the middle. And they were the ones that suffered.
As a child, I didn't really think about how somebody would make the abuse stop. As a child, adults are so powerful. And they can fix things, they can make things better. And that's what I wanted, was for them to fix it and make it better. For me, if an adult had been able to believe me and act on that belief, whether it was a belief founded on medical evidence or because of verbal disclosure, to believe me and make the abuse stop would have been all of my wishes at once.